Hi class, welcome back to Psych 241, Social Psychology. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 6, and we're going to be diving into the world of emotions. A couple quick announcements. Stop by office hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30. Stop by appointment as well. Don't forget the other assignments that are kind of ongoing here. We pretty much just ended a big wave of assignments being due, but keep an eye on the ones that are coming up next. So today we're going to be talking about a couple different things. First, we'll start off by talking about what is an emotion. As I've mentioned in a couple of my classes, hopefully to you guys, I took an emotion class with an emotion researcher during graduate school, and it was just purely about what are emotions. And I think I walked out of there with more questions than when I entered, which honestly was probably a good thing. But so we'll talk about what an emotion is. We'll spend some time talking about emotional expressions and how we express ourselves to the outside world. We'll then talk about emotions in a social world and how they impact us. And finally, we'll spend some time talking about happiness, what it is, and how we get it. But as we've mentioned, we're moving to this VLQ kind of aspect of the class. So for this, what I want you guys to do is go ahead and answer the following questions. I'll go over it and then I'll pause the video. Well, I'll let you take some time to pause the video, answer these questions, and then you can hit play to keep going. Right, so the idea here is I want you to just tell me, what are emotions? So define what an emotion is and then list a few. But I also want you to tell me what aren't emotions. We certainly have some feelings that we wouldn't call emotions. What are they? And why do we not classify these as emotions? So to give you an example, something like hungry isn't typically classified as an emotion, but it is a feeling. Why? How about things like that? And then this other question, are there gender differences in emotion? So based on the words that you write down, the emotions you write down, put a M next to, let's say, emotions that are more manly, masculine, male, and put a W next to emotions that you find to be more related to women or more feminine. If they're both, just put B or something like that. So go ahead and answer these questions, and we'll go ahead and talk a bit about this on the other side. All right, so what is an emotion? Well, an emotion is actually a very specific word in social psychology. So I'd like to take a moment to break down some different types of what we consider emotional phenomena. And the first one is this very broad term called affect, right? Spelled like affect, not like effect, but affect. An affect, as it's pronounced, is any kind of emotional phenomena that you can experience. And you're kind of probably thinking, okay, so what is that like? Well, we have this word emotions, but it's a very specific meaning in psychology, and emotions are brief and acute changes in conscious experience. They're often not just a change in conscious experience, but also physiology, and these occur in response to what we consider a meaningful, personally meaningful situation, right? So if something happens to you or something that you identify with very strongly, it's probably going to change the way you think about things, how you act possibly, and how you're feeling those things in terms of physiology. And they only emotions last for about 1 to 5 minutes. But then we also have this other concept of mood, right? Mood are these affective states that operate in the background of consciousness that we're not really paying too much attention to, but they tend to last longer than most emotions, right? This might be if it's about 2 p.m. and you're looking, you're going, why am I so tired right now? Now, whether tired is an emotion is to be displayed, but if you're feeling grumpy and you think, why have I been feeling that way? Those are operating in the background. Maybe you become aware of them, but they're lower key. They're not as we say, kind of expressive or as noticeable as what we consider a traditional emotion. So there are a lot of different emotions, and we'll spend some time talking about this, but this is a really interesting wheel I found in terms of different words for different emotions, and all of these you'll see are similar in some ways, but they're not exactly the same. Now, we can talk about different emotions, and we will, but I want to talk about a specific type of emotion before we really get into anything else, and this is this idea of self-conscious emotions, right? A type of emotion that requires us to have a sense of self. We have to be able to recognize that we are individuals and that other people are themselves, and how, our actions are actually playing a part in our lives. And this usually we consider these occur typically as a function of meeting or not meeting expectations and abiding or not abiding by society's rules. And so what are some of these self-conscious emotions? So what emotion would you be thinking of here? Well, typically we think of things like shame, feelings of guilt. We can talk about the difference between shame and guilt as well, because they're very similar words, but they have very different meanings. Feeling humiliated, feeling embarrassed, and on the other hand, right, these are all negative. We can talk about pride, which is something positive. And there's two actually types of pride. There's this idea of authentic pride, so a pride where you are, right, legitimately have earned it. If you win a Olympic medal, you have the right to be proud of that. That's a good reason to be proud. So that we would consider authentic pride, where we also have this idea of hubristic pride, or pride that maybe is either not as well earned or a kind of falsely believed, or generally considered more of that kind of bad version of pride. So not only can we talk about what different emotions are, how many there are, all of things like this. When we talk about what emotions are, there's actually 5 criteria we can talk about that really set emotions apart. So emotions are usually temporary, right? They typically have a clear beginning and ending. If you're to get a question right or get the best score on an exam right in first grade, you're not going to be feeling happy about that when you are a senior living in a nursing home. Right? This is going to be, right, as we said, a very short time, 5 or so minutes, and it typically has a clear beginning or ending. So nothing like that, but they do have a short time that they are active. We can also talk about this word valence, that emotions are what we call valenced. And this is a sense of, we term this in terms of positive, negative, a mixture of both, things like bittersweet. But really, I'm going to talk about 2 dimensions of emotion here, and I think this is very helpful. So the first one, as we said, was valence. So how emotion is what we would consider positive or negative, can be mixed as well. But there's also this idea of arousal. So when we, again, are talking about arousal, we're not talking about sexual arousal, we're talking about physical arousal. And by physical arousal, we mean kind of your body getting ready for fight or flight. Right? So a heightened physiological or possibly psychological activity might be caused by this. So your thoughts might be racing, your heart might be racing, things of that sort. So, right, let's go ahead and look at what we mean by these two. So, right, we have our valence over here in terms of negative to positive. So, right, very negative emotions, things like sad, versus very positive emotions, things like pleased or relaxed. We can also talk about arousal and how kind of pumped up this emotion is getting you, right? Are you kind of calm and being like, yeah, that's great? Or, are you super excited and ready to go? And both of those are positive emotions, but they differ in this level of arousal. And this is a really useful way to be able to talk about what an emotion is and isn't and how we kind of classify them. So we know that emotions are temporary. We know that emotions are going to be important in this idea of arousal and valence. But what's interesting is emotions actually alter our thought processes. So in the same way that some of those biases and cognitions we talked about in the last couple of chapters can influence our thought processes, even our emotional states can. So they can shift our attention. When we have negative emotions, we typically narrow our attention. Sometimes we focus that attention inward, right? And think about if you get a bad grade on an exam, you might be thinking, why did I do that? Why am I so dumb? But you can also think about this in terms of other negative emotions. Fear, for instance. Fear is going to shift your attention to be very narrow. It's going to focus you on something, right? Say the bear that's chasing after you. And it's going to show you, right, hopefully, that's going to be useful in showing you how to get out of this situation. Now, positive emotions, on the other hand, widen attention. And so what we mean is that kind of more broad or like happy, positive emotions, things like awe, right? We can talk about a feeling of awe. We know this is a very widened attentional state of how massive the world is or how small you might be compared to it. I have a friend who studies awe. And the idea is that this actually widens attentions and actually makes you a little bit more likely to make kind of larger connections between things, a broadened cognitive perspective, as you will. Additionally, emotional experiences trigger what we call an action tendency. And so an action tendency is how we might choose to act in a certain situation, right? So we have this approach avoidance action tendency. So negative emotions facilitate withdrawing or kind of pulling back, while positive emotions might push you to approach certain things. Right, which we see here. So positive emotions facilitate the exploration or approach of objects, so more likely to go out and explore. Lastly, emotional experiences are passions that we feel. We often don't have much control over our emotional states. We can downregulate or upregulate, we might say, to try to relax it or kind of ramp it up. But, right, think about, here's an example. I really don't like traffic. Traffic is one of those things where I don't like sitting in the middle of nowhere for no particular reason. And when I get in traffic, I tend to get frustrated, right? And I don't have really control over, I mean, I'm getting better, I should say, but it's not like I freak out that bad. But the idea is, back on track, the idea is that if we feel a certain way, we might not have the most control over it. It might just kind of happen. Right? But we can modify this with thoughts, and right. So what I might not do is think about how obnoxious everybody is, and right, not think about how I could go hit somebody with a tire iron or do some kind of road rage incident and cause one. But recognizing that emotions are these very intricate, very difficult to describe phenomenon. Hopefully, we'll spend some time in class talking about them as well. Moving on to emotional expressions. Now, well, the real question is for us here, we know that there's all types of different emotions. We know they mean a lot of different things, but are there ways that we can see across cultures, across pretty much everyone in the world, that emotions are universal? Well, yeah, we have a couple. So sadness typically is a universal emotion. Happiness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise, and maybe contempt. The jury's not quite out on that one. But the idea is that you can go pretty much anywhere in the world, and if you are making somebody laugh, they're going to smile. If you are making if you are intimidating somebody, you will be able to see fear on their face the same way you would see it here. That's a bad one to say that you're intimidating people here. But I think that's really interesting and unique. And what that tells us more than anything is that, these universal or basic emotions are going to really serve this very deeply rooted purpose if they're that universal. There's not many things that are that universal in terms of culture being able to understand one another. Our languages aren't the same, but our facial expressions are. And so I find that to be an incredibly interesting factor about emotions and what role they play in our lives. Now, just to kind of show this, what I want you to do is on the next slide from the top left to the bottom right, so it's going to be 2 rows, so you'll go like you're reading across, just describe or just tell me which emotion does each person display, and were any of them tough for you to figure out, and if so, why? So here they are. I'll go ahead and pause the video, and when you're done, we'll talk about the next slide. So what's very interesting about this is not only do we have these universal emotions, but some cultures are actually defined by specific emotions, and these don't have to be the universal emotions, right? And what we call these are focal emotions, and this just is an emotion that seems to be particularly common within a particular culture. While you're going through this, we will talk about this, but think about, what do you think the American focal emotion is and why? We'll talk about that as well during class, but why do we have these culture-defined emotions or very specific, unique emotions to cultures? Well, I don't want to say unique, but kind of widely shared. Well, we call this affect valuation theory, that emotions promote important cultural ideas which we value, and they play an important role in our social lives, and different emotions matter more to different cultures. Interestingly, we also have what we call display rules and norms for controlling emotional expression. So we can change the intensity of our emotions, right? We can make it kind of greater or less, like, oh, wow, that's amazing, even if it's not. Or we can mask emotions. And what's really interesting is this is very unique between different cultures. I think of the times when I was in Europe, and one interesting thing that I learned was American tourists are very quickly picked up on because they smile at everybody. So when you walk by somebody, you smile. I mean, that's just kind of the common thing to do. In America, yeah, but in Europe, no. If you're not smiling, that's more of what that typical culture was, or at least it was where I was in Luxembourg. And I found that to be an incredibly interesting difference here. And it says that Americans have this strong display rule to intensify happy emotions versus, maybe hide emotions or other things like that. Something I think is really interesting, and we'll talk about why it's important to be able to intensify or mask certain emotions here during class. So the next question I have is, which of these do you think is a real smile? And this is a video lecture question again. So go ahead and just tell me which of these you think is a real smile. Is it 1 or 2? And we'll talk about it on the next slide. Okay, so the correct answer is 1. And the reason probably most of you picked up on is this idea of, the eyes is a really helpful tool. Now, how helpful are the eyes in telling emotions? Well, on the other hand, which of these to you looks right? And you don't have to answer that, but they look about the same. But when we look at the eyes, we see that it's the second guy over here, I guess count 2. But the reason I want to talk about that and talk about this idea of a Duquesne smile, right? The idea that you need this these kind of creased eyes is it's very useful for us to be able to tell a real from a fake smile, to be able to know that difference in maybe intentions or things like that. Which is why you're still able to tell people are smiling right today when people are wearing their masks, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And this topic used to usually get a lot of people in intro when I would teach on it. People would be like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. But I feel like now that the mask situation's here, people are going to know that. Okay, so let's talk about emotions in the social world as well. So we know emotions are critical in our success as a species. But what I want to ask you is, what social benefits do some of these emotions give us? So I'll give you some, well, you guys have all the time in the world, so go ahead and pause the video after I list these and tell me what social benefits do, these different emotions give us. Things like happiness, things like fear, anger, feeling shameful or guilty, and things like love. What benefits do we get from these? And are there any other ones you can think of? So go ahead and answer that, and then we will continue on the next slide. One thing that emotions do for us in the social world is they influence our perception of different things. So again, in the same way we talk about how different biases influence our perception, how schemas influence our perception, how social cognition influences our perception, emotions influence our perception. One study looking at the likelihood of terrorist attacks asked people 2 months after 9/11 to just write about the terrorist attacks. And how they had them do this was half of them wrote about this in terms of a way that made them angry, or half of them wrote about this in a way that made them frightened. And then they were asked the likelihood of a future terrorist attack. And what you actually see is, for people in the frightened condition, they think there's a higher likelihood of a terrorist attack happening on U.S. soil than those in the angry condition. So this suggests that people who are fearful, they tend to perceive bad things are more likely to come around the corner. They tend to be more cautious. And that's a pretty useful thing. Now, not only do these influence perception, they also influence reasoning. And so what do we mean by this? What we mean by being able to kind of think creatively and flexibly. This is what we call the broaden and build hypothesis. So in the same way we talked about this approach avoidance motivation, we can also talk about this in a similar way called broaden and build. Now, these are two different things, the approach avoidance and this broaden and build, but I think they fall into very similar camps, So positive emotions broaden thoughts. They make us think kind of wider and in a more kind of lateral thinking, where actually negative emotions, on the other hand, kind of don't do that. So when you are in a positive mood state, you're more likely to think kind of broadly. And one study that did this, and you don't need to know this study, but had participants look at some words and just generate some related words. So things like carpet. And what you see is that happy people, or people in positive emotions, will say more kind of creative or interesting words that are related to things like carpet, like a bearskin rug, rather than just rug. Instead of stick, you might have things like sword, cane, other kind of more related but broadened terms. And things like rock, I put vehicle here as a joke, but I don't know. Actually don't have the one off the top of my head. Apologies for that. Now, this next one is very kind of intricate, and we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about this in class. But emotions influence this idea of moral judgment. So this, as I have been questioned by a philosophy student in my class before, is predicating a couple different beliefs in the idea that we do have a moral set of judgments. So let's go with that for a second. Right, and the one topic we'll talk about here, one of the models we'll talk about here, there's two, is the idea that people have what we call this social intuition, right? So they have this fast emotional reaction to morally relevant events. So when they hear about something that's morally good or bad, they have quick judgments, right? We could say these are very automatic processes. And those automatic judgments influence the way they reason to arrive at a judgment of right or wrong. So in the same way that emotions influence how we perceive events, they also influence how we decide to reason about events. So recognizing that with this social intuitionist model, we use whatever our kind of intuition is, or our first gut feeling, and we use that as kind of the basis for our understanding. So the idea is that these judgments are based on intuitions or gut feelings. But these intuitions may not be rational. And this is a guy named Jonathan Haidt. And so this social intuitionist model really looks like this. So you read about a situation. When you read about that situation, it provokes an emotion, right? So you read about a situation where a man kicks a puppy. And that brings out this emotion of like anger and kind of sympathy for the dog. And that leads you to an intuition. Well, if I'm feeling angry at the guy, he probably did something bad, because why else would my body react that it's angry? Or if I might feel sympathy for the dog, and I might think, oh, the dog is harmless and is not to blame in this. And that leads us to a moral judgment that the man was wrong. Now, it could be the case where the dog was trying to bite the person, right? And he had every right to do this. But based on that emotion we have on a situation, that's going to influence how we think about this. So the other one that we'll talk about is this idea of the moral foundations theory. And the moral foundations theory is this idea that we have 5 foundations. In the same way we have 5 pillars in this class, we have 5 pillars of morality. You could consider this. And these are the domains in which specific emotions actually guide our judgments. So we have these different domains, the first of which is care versus harm, right? So when we see suffering of others, or especially vulnerable others, we feel bad, or we feel sympathy because we care for people, and we don't like people who harm other people. We can talk about fairness and cheating. So people who cut the line or cheat in a way, especially that hurts you, we consider that to be an egregious sin a lot of times, and we might try to punish people who act unfairly. And people who do act fairly are seen as much better people. This idea of loyalty and betrayal, the importance of loyalty, and when that loyalty is gone, how that often leads to the exclusion of a group, and how your group decides to commit to one another. We can also talk about authority versus subversion. So finding one's place in a social hierarchy. Are you on the do certain people should have authority over others? Should certain people be subservient to others? How do you look at that? And the final one is this idea of purity and degradation. Right, so avoiding dangerous contaminants and socially impure ideas and actions. So if you know about, forget it off the top of my head. Macbeth. So if you remember Macbeth, Lady Macbeth tries to get out a spot of blood on her hands when there isn't. So this idea of trying to wash your hands of your sins, be they metaphorical, is something that is argued based on this moral foundations theory. So between all of this with this emotions in the social world, what you need to remember is how emotions influence us, how we understand them, and how they influence, right, our different types of reasoning, perception, thoughts, moral judgments, all this kind of stuff. But with that in mind, let's move on to happiness here. And here's a good question, right? What does it mean to be happy? Right? What are the components of happiness? And we're going to go ahead and talk about that in class. And I do want you guys to think about that. And we'll talk about what those components are then. So the next question that one I am going to have you guys answer is, do we know what makes us happy? And how I'll ask this is, right, just tell me, how do you think you would feel tomorrow if you won the lottery today? And then how do you think you would feel a year from now if you won the lottery today? Oops, excuse me, didn't put those on. So go ahead and answer those questions, and then we can talk about some of this as well. All right, so one very interesting kind of subfield of emotion research is this look into this, what we call affective forecasting. So forecasting, right, looking in the future of our emotions. So this idea of predicting whether an event will influence future emotions and for how long those emotions will be influenced. And one very interesting study that looked at this is called the Luckies versus Leftovers study, which is a hilarious title when you figure out what luckies and leftovers mean. So this was a study looking at the expected impact of breaking up with a romantic partner. And so they had two groups. The first group were the lucky group, and they had not experienced a breakup yet. So they were recruited, and they were they were recruited for this study because they had not broken up with a partner. And then they had this idea of the leftovers, which were people that had broken up with their partner within the last 2 months. So leftover. And what they were asked to do was rate their current satisfaction. So luckies, how satisfied are you in life? Leftovers, how satisfied are you in life? But additionally, they asked luckies to rate something else. They asked luckies to do this affective forecasting, right? So rate the perceived satisfaction that you'll feel in 2 more months. The luckies were asked to rate, hey, if you broke up tomorrow, how would you feel 2 months from now? So the luckies actually got to answer 2 questions where the leftovers answered 1. Apologies for that, and I want to be very clear on that. So what did they find? Well, they found that, interestingly enough, the actual leftovers, the people who had broken up with their significant other in the past 2 months, felt about as good as the lucky group. But the lucky group thought that if they broke up tomorrow, 2 months from now, they would be feeling pretty bad, comparatively. So what does this mean? Well, this suggests that actually negative emotions don't last forever, right? That you think you'll be down here, but in reality, life goes on, right? The people who did break up 2 months ago, or within the last 2 months, we're okay. We're not very good at knowing what we're going to feel like in the future. That's a really interesting thing. And why is that the case? Well, we'll talk about 3 specific things. We'll talk about immune neglect, focalism, and this idea of duration neglect. So let's first talk about immune neglect, which is this tendency to underestimate the capacity for being resilient in responding to difficult life events, leading to an overestimation in the belief that life's problems will reduce personal well-being. So what do we mean by that? That's a kind of wordy definition. We tend to not recognize that we're pretty resilient. We tend to forget that we bounce back pretty quickly in most situations. And then we overestimate how long it's going to take us to get back on our feet. So this is a great example based on the luckies versus leftovers. So in reality, what you see here is that people forget that we're going to feel better pretty soon afterwards. They think it's going to take a lot longer. What's very interesting is in the kind of flipped question that I asked you, right? Instead of winning the lottery, how happy would you be a year after losing your leg? People tend to be about as happy as they were the day before they lost their leg, assuming, right, this was an accident, right? The idea here is that, right, you kind of learn to live with the bad stuff, and the good stuff we'll talk about in a minute. We actually haven't gotten there. So this idea of the immune neglect is that we are kind of we're neglecting the fact that we shrug this stuff off pretty easy. Now, the next one we'll talk about is this idea of focalism, and we might focus too much on a specific aspect of an event while neglecting the possible impact of other factors. So, for instance, as a Midwesterner, right, I grew up in the place that was the cloudiest place in the country, pretty much tied with Seattle for the cloudiest days of the year. It was always within 10 days, one way or another. We just didn't get the rain. So, if you asked me, would I be happier living in California than the Midwest? Most people said, yeah, of course I'd be happier living in the beauty of California. But in reality, when they asked Californians how happy they were living in California, there wasn't any difference in ratings. So, right, that is a really interesting topic and a really interesting thing to mention, is this idea that we might be focusing too much on the fact that, right, California is this beautiful place when, right, I mean, I live in Florida. That's pretty cool. The beach is 30 minutes away. It doesn't mean I go there every day. And in reality, my day-to-day life hasn't really changed based on where I've moved. So, right, we might put too much effort on this. Regarding failing to get your dream job, I have a story about that, if you remind me, but let's move on to the last thing, talking about past events. And while talking about past events, we'll get to the third portion of this understanding of effective forecasting. So what makes us think of how good or bad something that's happened in the past is, right? Think about a memory you have. Why is it good? Why is it bad? I mean, if it's not an extreme memory, there's probably some reasons that you think it's good and some reasons it's bad, but is it everything? Well, there's two specific factors that might influence this, the first of which is what we call the peak moment. So this is the highest or theoretically lowest point of an emotional event. And then there's also this idea of an end moment mattering. In the same way we talk about the recency effect, right, the end moment, the last few moments of an event, oftentimes these might be things like goodbyes, they tend to be very influential on how we remember our past events. But you might be asking, what about the length of an event? Shouldn't a 10-day cruise be a lot better than a one-day cruise? Not really. Duration is really pretty unimportant in terms of our memory and how we remember our past events. It doesn't really matter. We might remember it being short but great, and it might also be long but great, but we don't put as much effort on those. So, right, we can think about the peak moment, the end feeling, and we know that length doesn't matter. So imagine that I take a vacation to a tropical paradise and spend several days snorkeling, and I lose my wallet at the airport. Well, likely, even though I had a great time snorkeling, I've now got to deal with this great time snorkeling and the fact that my wallet was lost. I might end up thinking it's not that great. An example from my own life. One time, my wife and I, when we were abroad, we were traveling to Venice. And we were taking a train from Milan that got stopped in a town for 4 hours. And so I'm sitting on this train in the middle of nowhere. Nobody speaks English. This was before I had an iPhone. And we just kind of had to sit there and wait. We didn't get into Venice until 2 o'clock in the morning. It was flooded. That is why the train was delayed, and I walked in water up to my knees in February to get to my hotel. I remember literally taking my boot and dumping water out of it like a movie, and it happened. But I then spent the next 3 days exploring Venice. It was during Carnival. It was actually Mardi Gras on the day that I was there, and there was some really cool stuff going on. I really enjoyed it, and I had a lovely train ride home. This is one of my favorite memories of going to Europe. My wife and I laugh about it all the time, right? The peak moment, while it was bad here, I had better moments here for the most part. The end was also great. I enjoyed the rest of my trip, and it was wonderful. So when you think about your memories and why you think an event was good or bad, think about, right, why the peak moment and the end feeling might be very important to this. Okay, so the last couple things about what makes us happy. Well, we know that social connections make us happy, right? Romantic relationships, friends, families, neighborhood, community, all of these things help to make us happy and involved in a community. Does money make us happy? That's a really good question. Yeah, it does. But it's not completely just that. It's only up to a certain point. That's about $75,000 a year. And you can think about that, and I'll ask during class, why? Why about 75 grand? Why isn't it more? Why isn't it less? So, right, remembering that what makes us happy? People, social connections. Does money make us happy? To a point, not really beyond that. So what else can we do to be happy? Well, we can practice gratitude. Gratitude is a very interesting thing because, right, it's this idea of taking time to appreciate yourself, others, and maybe, achievements that you or others have done. And what I really think is interesting about this is a lot of the research suggests that this is a very positive kind of feedback loop into getting more gratitude from other people and continuing to build yourself, your community up. So, right, nobody doesn't like a compliment. And, my dissertation was on self-compassion, which is some part of gratitude and involves, feeling compassionate for yourself and being okay with saying, right, you did a good job. And there were some really interesting things I found out about self-compassion and why gratitude might be useful. But generally, right, kind of makes sense in terms of being a good person that you might want to practice gratitude. Giving gifts actually helps you, right, be happy. Right? And these don't have to be of money, but they can be of time, donating your time to a food shelter or something. And this is the idea of this really cool study by Dunn et al. Talking about spending money, where participants were asked to give their baseline happiness one day that they came in, and half the participants were given $5 and half the participants were given $20. And they were told to spend it on either themselves or other people. So a quarter of the people spent $5 on themselves, a quarter of the people spent $20 on someone else, etc. What do we see? People get a lot more satisfaction when they're spending money on other people. And not only that, when they're spending money on themselves, when they're spending money on themselves and not feeling as happy. But you can also notice here, the amount didn't really matter. Right? If you buy somebody $20 worth of chocolate or $5 worth of chocolate, generally just thinking about somebody and giving them that seems to be very important here for happiness. So the last way that we can, right, gain happiness that we know of actually comes from a man named Tom Gilovich. I watched him give this talk one time. He's a well-known social psychologist. And I actually believe he might be one of the authors of this textbook. I forget if it's this one or not. But the idea is that we like to put oftentimes goods as kind of our number one thing to do with money in a way that makes us happy. But what research has found, is that experiences are much more effective than goods in terms of bringing long-term happiness. Why? We habituate to goods. We think that goods are great for a little bit, but eventually they depreciate in value, we say. But experiences, we can't go back, so we tend to have a more positive emotional state about them as time goes on. And think about it this way. When you get a new phone that first day, you probably feel great. That's a really great phone. But right after owning that phone for a week or right a month, it's cool. I enjoy my phone, but I don't think about how great or unique it is. On the other hand, if I cultivate my experiences to things that bring me awe, right? So seeing how amazing the world is, seeing how small I am, again, awe researchers, I know them and I think they do some really cool stuff, right? Going to see the Grand Canyon, right? Recognizing how cool some of the stuff in Florida is, quite honestly, right? The manatee place right kind of down the street, that's an experience that I think is something that would probably bring me more happiness than if I just bought a t-shirt or something. So finding ways to kind of cultivate these really wonderful experiences for yourselves are going to be more effective dollar per dollar if you're looking at long-term happiness in the most part. So all I want to do to kind of end this class is ask you one last video lecture question. So given what we've spoken about regarding happiness, what are 3 things that you can do to live a happier life? And I know it sounds silly, but based on what we talked about, what do you think are things that you should maybe be looking at? And maybe this is a nice gentle push in that direction. So with that in mind, right, Make sure you're keeping up to date on everything. If you do have any questions, please let me know. Stop by office hours, whatever you need. Other than that, have a great evening, day, I guess. I don't know when you're watching this, but I will see you when I see you.